مشاهدينا مرحبا بكم في حوارات السياق. يحذر المسؤولون العسكريون ومطلعو الأمن القومي من عودة ظهور تنظيم داعش، حيث تتأرجح الظروف في جميع أنحاء الشرق الأوسط وإفريقيا لمجيء التنظيم للمرة الثانية كقوة إرهابية رئيسة تهدد الاستقرار العالمي. عموما للمزيد من المتابعة حول هذا الملف ينضم إلينا تشارلز ليستر مؤلف كتاب الجهاد السوري. أستاذ تشارلز مرحبا بك معنا.
Thank you for having me.
منذ هزيمة داعش تتكرر التحذيرات من عودته. هل التهديد حقيقي هذه المرة؟
I think it's always a threat and it's always been a threat. This is a terrorist organization that has existed and flourished for a longer period of time without territory than with it. So the fact that ISIS's territorial control was defeated in 2019 did not in any way spell its defeat. It merely started a new phase of that kind of insurgency that ISIS has been carrying out for over 2 decades now. So we're in a new phase, a much more challenging one. It's frankly a lot easier to combat a terrorist group that controls territory in the open than to defeat one that's operating in the shadows.
ماذا عن الضربات الأمريكية في سوريا العام الماضي والتي قتلت العديد من قادة التنظيم وكبار المسؤولين؟ هل أحدثت تغييرا أو ساعدت على الأرض؟
Oh, it certainly helps, and no doubt that actually the US military presence in partnership with the Syrian Democratic Forces is probably the only thing that is preventing ISIS from significantly sort of resurging or recovering on Syrian territory, and frankly, from having a knock-on effect next door in Iraq. I think without that US troop presence, we'd be in a much worse position. The Syrian regime with Russian support has proven largely incapable of containing the ISIS presence in the central Badia, the desert of Syria. And so for now, we're in certainly a better position than we could be, but the challenge is really, really significant. And the most responsibility here lies with the SDF. And they're a non-state actor, so they struggle by themselves to contain that without that US troop presence and without the international coalition's added support.
ما هي قوة التنظيم حاليا وما هي أماكن تمركزه؟
So, I mean, it's very hard to measure, in numbers. Certainly the US military has estimated that there are probably at least 10,000 ISIS militants still active and present in Syria and Iraq combined. So if we're talking about that Syrian-Iraq heartland, that's obviously a very significant number. But as I say, they're not controlling territory, they're not patrolling, so it is really hard to measure. I think in Syria, we're seeing at least one attack a day. That is markedly more than what we saw in 2022. And in Iraq, just at the end of 2022, we saw some really significant, very deadly attacks, not just in the north, in the disputed region between the KRG and sort of mainland Iraq, but also down south. So clearly this is an organization that is seeking to send a message. We're still here, we're still fighting. In their own words, the days of the Khalifa are still very much alive. And that is a challenge that the Iraqi government and various actors in Syria, both in and of themselves, but also collectively, are going to have to be challenging, I think, even more so this year than they were last.
حتى أفهم منك هنا، نحن نتحدث عن جيل جديد وليس جيل 2014.
It's a continuation of exactly the same challenge that we faced in 2014, with one sort of exception, which is ISIS is now a much more local terrorist organization than it was a big international one in Syria and Iraq in earlier years. Of course, the vast majority of its foreign fighters have been arrested or killed over the last 8 years or so. So the threat that we face now on Syrian and Iraqi territory is almost entirely presented by Syrian and Iraqi members of ISIS. In many ways, I think that's actually both quite telling for us as outsiders, but also quite dangerous. The fact that they have managed to retain that many fighters that impose that kind of a terrorist challenge, I think is worrying. After all the destruction that was caused by ISIS and amidst the battles with ISIS, I think the fact that it has managed to keep those fighters and arguably probably recruit new ones on that local level is, I think, a worrying indication of the fact that this is an organization that still retains some support, but also that there are deep-rooted problems in Syria and Iraq that allow an organization like this to continue to operate.
بعض المحللين الأمريكيين حذروا من ما سموه الإهمال الاستراتيجي من قبل الولايات المتحدة وحلفائها لخطر عودة ظهور داعش. هل تتفق مع هذا الطرح؟
I think if you look at the American Department of Defense and the Central Command, they clearly see the ISIS threat as very significant and deserving of being a priority. So as far as they're concerned, it's a priority. But then when you kind of zoom up and look at the White House and the Biden administration, and before it, the Trump administration, that ISIS, as soon as it lost its territory, was no longer a major priority. And I think when we have the war in Ukraine and great power competition with China going on, the war against ISIS has definitely been relegated down the list of priorities. Ultimately, if there's going to be, more investment in stabilizing northeastern Syria or more investment in terms of really bringing the fight to ISIS on the ground, that isn't a decision to be made by the Department of Defense. That's a decision made in the White House. And it's a decision that, frankly, isn't going to be made because it is no longer a priority. So the strategic neglect, I think, is an accurate accusation, but to the political leadership of the United States and allied governments, not to the military forces who are on the ground actually facing this threat on a day-to-day basis.
مصر نجحت في تحييد داعش في شمال سيناء. رئيسها أعلن قبل أيام قرب انتهاء التنظيمات الإرهابية هناك. ما الذي فعلته مصر؟
I think, frankly, what's been accomplished in Egypt is not too dissimilar to what we saw accomplished in Syria and Iraq in previous years, which is that we no longer see an ISIS in the Sinai which is controlling territory or visibly operating in the open. I think to declare ISIS defeated in Egypt is very premature. They're still conducting attacks to this day. They're still operating. So I think what we've seen really, as I say, is a kind of replication of this idea that as long as they're not controlling territory, as long as they're not kind of operating in our face, we've done enough to proclaim that political achievement. But that is short-sighted. We have to learn this lesson that terrorist organizations have existed for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years and never needed territory. So the idea that as soon as we take that away from them, the job is done, alas, is fantasy. The challenge now that Egypt faces and that we face in Syria and Iraq is much more complicated. And actually it requires more resources and more attention than challenging a group with land under its control.
شارل، كنت تحدثنا عن العراق، كذلك ليبيا. هل التهديد بالنسبة لهما أكبر؟ هل تحتاجان لدعم من الولايات المتحدة؟
I think in that respect, I think the ISIS threat in Libya is much diminished. Obviously, the situation in Libya is extremely complicated and fragile and unstable, but that's a different kind of challenge. But in terms of the counterterrorism challenge, I think actually what we've seen is the terrorism challenge, both from ISIS and Al-Qaeda, sort of shift southwards from Libya more into the African interior. So the Sahel is really the beating heart of the global jihadist sort of operation these days. I think it's quite concerning now for the international community, the scale to which both Al-Qaeda and Daesh have managed to establish a very solid foothold in the Sahel and other areas of Africa. And that is really, if you want to talk about strategic negligence, our kind of complete refusal to pay any attention to the situation in Africa is going to come back to hit us one day. I think we've vastly underestimated the sort of strategic significance of what's happening there.
نقطة أخرى كنت ذكرتها قبل قليل أود أن نتوسع بخصوصها عن عناصر داعش في السجون في العراق وسوريا. هل يشكلون أي خطر؟
This is, I think, the most important thing for the international community to be thinking of. This is totally unprecedented. We said in 2014 and 2015, the scale of ISIS was completely unprecedented. How on earth are we going to challenge a terrorist organization with tens of thousands of fighters? Well, guess what? 30,000 of them are still alive in Syrian and Iraqi prisons. About half of them are in Syrian prisons, but they're not really prisons. Most of them are former schools with big walls built around them. ISIS is more than capable, if it wants to, of trying to attack those prisons and break prisoners out, as we saw in January last year with an enormous attack that resulted in over 500 people being killed in the space of a week. So when you look at the fighter situation, 30,000 is staggering and extremely concerning. When the Iraq is not going to be able to keep those individuals in prison for the rest of their lives. One day they will either be released or, I fear, broken out. Even or additionally concerning is the fate of mostly the women and children who came out of the ISIS state and are now incarcerated mostly in a camp called Al-Hol in eastern Syria. 60,000 of them, roughly 2/3, are from Syria and Iraq. When you look at the returns that the international community is trying to facilitate to Iraq, it's going to take at least 6 or 7 years for that return process to be completed of those individuals going back to Iraq. The Syrian returns have completely stopped because all of the Syrians left in Al-Hol are from regime-controlled areas, and there is no way the international community is either legally or ethically going to be sending those individuals back to Damascus. And then beyond that, we have about 15,000 Syrian women and children who are growing up, who are from 57 third countries all around the world. And at the moment, it looks like it's going to take about 35 years just to get the children home, by which time they're going to be in their 40s. This is just a staggering challenge. And when I talk about this, I always use the example of Guantanamo Bay, of course, something that most Americans would like to forget about. But 21 years ago, 700 men were taken to Guantanamo Bay from a variety of countries. 21 years later, there are still 35 people in Guantanamo Bay. We're now talking about 30,000 male prisoners and 60,000 women and children prisoners. This is, a challenge that we have never faced before. And frankly, the solution isn't there. So yes, for ISIS, this is their biggest opportunity. This is their biggest recruitment, rallying cry, mobilizing tool. And we're coming up dramatically short in terms of having a response or a solution.
حتى أفهم منك فقط، مسألة بهكذا تعقيد لماذا يتم تجاهلها؟ لماذا لم توضع استراتيجيات للتعامل معها من الدول الغربية والولايات المتحدة؟
Well, I think for the last so since the territorial defeat of ISIS in 2019, I would say for 3 years or so, pretty much, maybe 2 years, we were completely ignoring the situation. It was just too big a nut to crack, to use an English phrase. It's just too big of a challenge to try to resolve. More recently, we have seen some good attention, particularly from Europe, with big US support. Of course, the US has got troops on the ground, so they see this as a real responsibility. I would say over the last 9 months, we've had some real momentum, particularly from European states, to repatriate mostly women and children. The men are a completely different challenge, which is good. But that significant momentum saw 0.5% of the women and children repatriated. So what was seen as really good news, good energy, good, real impetus to actually begin repatriating people back, we barely put a dent in the challenge. And so governments are going to have to think outside of the box here. If repatriation takes so long, what are we going to do if all of a sudden American troops have to leave Syria? These prisons are effectively going to be undefended. And then we're going to have 12,000 male ISIS fighters on the loose, and we're going to be back to 2014 all over again. There just has to be a lot of thinking about this within the coalition. And honestly speaking, it's going to take serious resources, one way or the other, money, troops, and elsewhere, to either better secure these facilities or to convince governments to take these people back, and then enter into the whole process of prosecution, investigation, reconciliation, rehabilitation. These are really, really challenging issues and subjects. So there's a lot of lessons to be learned, but there's a lot of ground to cover if we're going to get anywhere close to preventing a return to what we saw develop in 2014.
أستاذ تشارلز ليستر، شكرا جزيلا للمشاركة معنا في حوارات السياق.
Thank you for having me.
مشاهدينا، شكرا على طيب المتابعة. إلى الملتقى.